In the fall of 1891, in the modest industrial town of Millerville, Pennsylvania, local authorities stumbled upon a discovery so deeply disturbing that official records were sealed immediately and stayed classified for more than 3 decades. 17 people were found shackled in the basement of the abandoned Millerville Opera House, their bodies showing unmistakable signs of prolonged captivity and deliberate, systematic abuse. What made this case even more chilling was that all 17 victims were, according to official records, already dead. Their death certificates had been filed months, sometimes years earlier, across 3 separate counties. The man behind it all, Cornelius Vanier, had spent over a decade running what looked from the outside like a perfectly legitimate traveling circus. But beneath those colorful tents, behind the laughter of children and the spectacle of the crowd, lay one of the most grotesque schemes of human exploitation ever recorded in American history. The local newspaper was barred from printing the full account, and witnesses were silenced through threats made by corrupt officials who had been profiting from this nightmarish enterprise for years. Before we go further into the story of Cornelius Vanier and his cabinet of wonders, I want to pause for just a moment. If stories like this fascinate you as much as they fascinate me, please subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into America's darkest historical mysteries. And I'm genuinely curious, where are you watching from tonight? Drop a comment below and tell me your state or city. Now, let's get into what truly happened in Millerville, Pennsylvania, during that terrible autumn of 1891. The discovery that would ultimately unravel Vanier's operation didn't come through careful police work. It came through a single, desperate act of courage from someone who had witnessed the horror with their own eyes. Millerville in 1891 was a town caught between 2 eras. The old Pennsylvania countryside, with its rolling hills and tight-knit German immigrant communities, was rapidly being swallowed by industrial progress. Coal mines spread across the landscape, and the newly completed Pennsylvania Railroad branch had brought prosperity to some and desperation to many others. The population had swelled to nearly 8,000 souls, a large number of them recent arrivals from Ireland, Germany, and Eastern Europe, lured by promises of steady work in the mines and steel foundries. It was a town where people kept to themselves, where a man's past mattered far less than his willingness to work hard and pay what he owed. That culture of willful blindness turned out to be precisely what Cornelius Vanier needed to run his twisted operation for so many years without ever being caught. Vanier himself cut an imposing figure. Tall, impeccably dressed, with the kind of commanding presence that made rooms go quiet when he entered. He claimed descent from a wealthy Dutch family in New York, though no one had ever taken the trouble to verify that. What mattered to the people of Millerville was that his money was real, and he spent it generously in their shops and taverns. He had purchased the old opera house in 1887, supposedly to use as winter quarters for his traveling show, Vandermeer's Cabinet of Wonders. On the surface, the Cabinet of Wonders looked like any other traveling circus of the era. There were acrobats, animal acts, musical performances, and yes, a freak show. Such exhibitions were wildly popular in late 19th century America, drawing paying crowds eager to stare at people with physical differences or unusual abilities. What set Vanier's show apart, locals would later recall, was the extraordinary quality of his performers and the haunting, almost supernatural nature of their acts. There was Eliza, billed as the bone serpent woman whose body contorted in ways that seemed to defy human anatomy entirely. There was Giant Jon, the Bavarian colossus, who stood nearly 8 feet tall and could bend iron bars with nothing but his bare hands. Most unforgettable of all was little Mary Catherine, known as the Singing Angel, a young woman with a voice of breathtaking beauty, who appeared to be missing both arms, though her sleeves were always carefully arranged to obscure the exact nature of her condition. What no audience member ever knew was that many of these performers had not chosen to be there. They had been carefully selected and acquired through means that wouldn't be fully understood until that terrible October day, when the truth finally came spilling into the light. The town's sheriff, Josiah Cromwell, had long since made his peace with the arrangement Vanier had proposed shortly after arriving in Millerville. A monthly payment of $50, more than most local men earned in 2 months, guaranteed that Cromwell never asked uncomfortable questions about Vanier's business practices or the occasional missing persons reports that seemed to follow the circus from one neighboring town to the next. Dr. Heinrich Kellerman had come to Millerville 6 months after Vanier, presenting himself as a German physician specializing in disorders of human development. He rented a small office above the general store and quickly established himself as Vanier's business partner and the show's official medical consultant. What the townspeople had no way of knowing was that Kellerman's medical credentials were entirely fabricated. His real area of expertise was chemistry, specifically the preparation of drugs capable of keeping people docile and compliant for extended periods of time. Together, these 3 men, Vanier, Cromwell, and Kellerman, had constructed what they believed to be the perfect criminal enterprise. They would identify suitable candidates in small towns throughout Pennsylvania and the surrounding states. People with disabilities, unusual physical characteristics, or simply those whose disappearance wouldn't raise immediate alarm. Orphans were particularly prized targets, as were recent immigrants with no family connections in America. Their method was sophisticated for the time. Kellerman would pose as a doctor offering free medical examinations or treatment to vulnerable individuals. Once he had them alone, a carefully prepared mixture of laudanum and other opiates would render them unconscious. By the time they woke up, they were hundreds of miles from home, chained in the basement of the Millerville Opera House with no memory of how they had arrived there. But the true horror of Vandermeer's operation went well beyond kidnapping. It was a systematic process of dismantling human beings and reshaping them into performers using techniques that blended psychological manipulation, physical abuse, and chemical dependency. The goal wasn't merely to make them perform. It was to make them believe they had no choice, no past, and no future beyond their assigned role in the Cabinet of Wonders. The first crack in Vandermeer's carefully constructed facade appeared on the evening of October 12, 1891, when a young woman staggered into the offices of the Millerville Weekly, Gazette, barely conscious and speaking in what seemed like disconnected, frantic fragments. Thomas Fairchild, the paper's editor and primary reporter, had been working late when he heard the desperate knocking at his door. When he opened it, he found a girl who appeared to be in her early 20s, though severe malnutrition had made her actual age difficult to determine. Her clothes were in tatters, her feet bare and bleeding, and her eyes held a wild, terrified expression that Fairchild would carry with him for the rest of his life. "They're still down there," she whispered, gripping his arm with surprising strength. "In the dark. They can't get out. The chains are too heavy." Fairchild helped her to a chair and offered her water, which she drank greedily. As she gradually calmed down, her story began to emerge in fragments that initially made very little sense. She spoke of a place beneath the opera house where people were kept in small rooms, of a man who came with needles and bitter medicine, of being forced to repeat the same movements over and over until her body gave out in pain. "My name is Sarah," she said, though even that simple fact seemed to unsettle her. "Sarah Henley. I think I'm from Lancaster. But they told me I was dead. They showed me papers that said I was dead." Fairchild was skeptical at first. The girl's account was so outlandish and her mental state so fragile that he wondered if she might be suffering from some form of dementia or hysteria. But something about her desperation, the specific, consistent details she provided, and the raw terror in her eyes, convinced him that she was telling the truth about something real. She described the layout of the opera house basement with remarkable precision, including architectural details that Fairchild knew to be accurate. She gave names and descriptions of specific individuals, other captives, that were far too detailed and consistent to be the product of delusion. Most compelling of all, she knew things about Veneer's business operations that no outsider could possibly have known. "There's a ledger," she said, her voice steadying as she spoke. "Mr. Veneer keeps it in his office. It has all our names in it. Where we came from, how much we cost. He calls us his investments. Some of those entries go back years, Mr. Fairchild. Years." As Sarah's account continued to unfold, Fairchild began to grasp the true scope of what she was describing. This wasn't a simple case of exploitation or abuse. It was an organized criminal enterprise that had been running in plain sight for the better part of a decade. The realization filled him with a mixture of horror and the unmistakable instinct of a journalist who knows when he's looking at the story of a lifetime. But first, he needed proof. And getting that proof would mean confronting some of the most powerful men in Millerville. Men with every resource and motivation to destroy anyone who threatened what they had built. Sarah's escape had only been possible because of a mistake in her evening medication. Kellerman's assistant, a nervous young man named Peter, who helped with the daily care of the captives, had miscalculated her dose of laudanum. Instead of the familiar stupor that normally followed her medication, Sarah had experienced an unusual spell of clarity and alertness. When Peter failed to properly secure her shackles during what should have been her most incapacitated period, she had managed to work herself free. The basement of the opera house was a maze of small, windowless rooms that had been converted into cells. Each room held a single captive chained to the wall in such a way that they could lie down, but couldn't come anywhere near the door. A complex system of pulleys and locks ensured that only Veneer and Kellerman could release the restraints. Sarah's cell had been adjacent to that of Jon, the giant whom audiences knew as the Bavarian Colossus. Through whispered conversations stretched across months, she had learned his real name, Jon Brenner, a simple-minded immigrant from Bavaria who had been working as a dock laborer in Philadelphia when Kellerman's men found him. Jon's enormous size and gentle disposition had made him perfect for Veneer's purposes, but the relentless drugging and psychological abuse had reduced him to a childlike state of total dependency. In the cell on her other side was Mary Catherine, the singing angel, whose real name was Catherine Ali. Catherine had been born with a rare condition that left her arms severely underdeveloped, but she had possessed a singing voice so remarkable it had made her something of a local celebrity back home in Scranton. She had vanished after accepting an invitation to audition for what she believed was a legitimate theatrical company. That had been 3 years earlier. The horror of their situation extended far beyond the physical captivity. Veneer and Kellerman had worked methodically to destroy each captive's sense of identity and hope. They were given new names, new fabricated histories, and were told repeatedly that their families believed them dead. False death certificates had been prepared and filed with local authorities, often with Sheriff Cromwell's assistance, as he maintained connections in multiple counties across Pennsylvania. The psychological manipulation was perhaps even crueler than the physical abuse. Captives were told that their families had stopped searching, that they had been forgotten, abandoned, written off as a burden, finally lifted. Forged letters, supposedly from loved ones, were shown to them as proof. For many of the captives, particularly those who had been imprisoned for years, this sustained assault on their sense of self-worth and their connection to the outside world had been devastatingly effective. Fairchild spent the next 3 days quietly investigating Sarah's claims. What he discovered chilled him to the bone. A review of death certificates filed in Millerville and surrounding counties over the previous 5 years revealed a deeply troubling pattern. An unusually high number of individuals with disabilities or unusual physical characteristics had supposedly died in accidents or from sudden illness, often with minimal witness testimony and cursory investigations at best. Even more alarming was the discovery that many of these supposedly deceased individuals bore striking resemblances to performers in Veneer's show. The dates of these deaths also correlated almost perfectly with the circus's travel schedule through various Pennsylvania towns. Armed with this preliminary evidence, Fairchild made the decision to confront Sheriff Cromwell directly. It was a decision that nearly cost him his life. Cromwell's office was located in the basement of the town hall, a cramped space that smelled of pipe tobacco and unwashed bodies. When Fairchild arrived on the morning of October 16th, he found the sheriff cleaning his revolver, an activity that felt very deliberately chosen to send a message. "Tom," Cromwell said, without looking up from his weapon, "I hear you've been asking some interesting questions around town." Fairchild had prepared carefully for this conversation, but facing Cromwell in his own territory, surrounded by wanted posters and the tools of law enforcement, he felt his confidence falter. Still, he pressed forward, raising the matter of the death certificates and their suspicious timing. Cromwell's response was swift and brutal. Without warning, he struck Fairchild across the face with the butt of his revolver, sending the journalist crashing to the floor, with blood streaming from a gash above his left eye. Fairchild looked up to find Cromwell standing over him, the gun now leveled at his head. "You're going to forget everything that crazy girl told you," Cromwell said, his voice calm and almost conversational. "You're going to forget you ever saw her. And if I hear you've been spreading stories about upstanding citizens like Mr. Veneer, well, accidents happen in mining towns, Tom. Men disappear all the time." But Cromwell had made a critical error. In his arrogance, he had essentially confirmed Sarah's story while simultaneously revealing his own complicity in the conspiracy. Fairchild, despite his terror, was still thinking like a journalist. Every word Cromwell spoke was another piece of evidence of the corruption that had allowed Veneer's operation to thrive for so long. Fairchild left the sheriff's office convinced he was in genuine mortal danger, but also more resolved than ever to expose the truth. He understood that he couldn't rely on local law enforcement, and that any attempt to contact state or federal authorities ran the risk of getting back to Cromwell before help could arrive. His solution was both brilliant and desperately dangerous. If he couldn't bring the authorities to the evidence, he would bring the evidence to the authorities and to the public. Over the following week, Fairchild worked with Sarah to plan a covert infiltration of the Opera House basement. Sarah's intimate knowledge of the building's layout and the daily routines of the guards would be essential, but the plan demanded precise timing and more than a little luck. The goal was not rescue, that would require far more resources than Fairchild could muster on his own. Instead, they would gather irrefutable proof of the captive's existence and Venier's criminal enterprise. Fairchild would photograph the basement cells, document the conditions of the prisoners, and, if possible, secure copies of Venier's records. But as they prepared for this dangerous mission, neither Fairchild nor Sarah had any idea that their activities had not gone unnoticed. Kellerman, whose training in observation and analysis made him instinctively paranoid, had begun to suspect that Sarah's escape was less random than it had initially appeared. On the evening of October 23rd, as Fairchild was preparing his camera equipment for the infiltration planned for the following night, Kellerman made a deeply unsettling discovery. A routine inventory of his medical supplies revealed that several vials of chloroform were missing, along with a quantity of photographic chemicals that had no legitimate medical use whatsoever. The realization that someone was planning to document his operation sent Kellerman into a panic. He immediately contacted Vanier and Cromwell, and the three men began implementing what they called their emergency protocol. A contingency plan they had developed for precisely this possibility. The emergency protocol was simple in its brutality. Eliminate all evidence, including the captives themselves. What Fairchild and Sarah didn't know was that their planned infiltration had already been anticipated. Kellerman's discovery of the missing chemicals had prompted the conspirators to dramatically accelerate their timeline. Rather than waiting to see what evidence might emerge against them, they had decided to eliminate the threat entirely. On the night of October 24th, 1891, as Fairchild and Sarah approached the Opera House under cover of darkness, they walked directly into a trap. The building appeared deserted, exactly as Sarah had predicted it would be. Vanier and his associates typically spent their evenings at the Millerville Social Club, a private establishment where the town's wealthy and influential residents gathered to drink, gamble, and conduct their business away from prying eyes. This routine had given Sarah the opportunity she needed to escape, and Fairchild was counting on it to provide the cover they needed for their investigation. They entered through a basement window that Sarah had deliberately left unlocked during her escape. The basement was pitch black, filled with the smell of human waste, unwashed bodies, and something else. A sweet, cloying odor that Fairchild couldn't immediately place. Using a small lantern with a heavily shaded flame, they began navigating the maze of makeshift cells. What Fairchild saw in that dim, wavering light would haunt him for the rest of his life. The captives were in far worse condition than Sarah's descriptions had prepared him for. Many appeared severely malnourished, their bodies bearing the unmistakable signs of systematic abuse and medical experimentation. Several seemed to be in states of drug-induced stupor, responding only minimally to Sarah's whispered attempts to reach them. Yon, the gentle giant, was shackled with chains that had worn deep grooves into his wrists and ankles. His enormous frame had been reduced to little more than skin and bones, and his eyes held a vacant, hollow expression that spoke of a mind broken far beyond repair. When Sarah spoke his name, a flicker of recognition crossed his face, but he seemed unable to comprehend what was happening around him. Catherine Alley was in even worse condition. The beautiful voice that had once made her a celebrated figure in her hometown had been reduced to a hoarse whisper, apparently the result of damage to her throat from being forced to perform while under the influence of Kellerman's drugs. She was conscious, but it seemed incapable of holding her focus on anything for more than a few seconds. As Fairchild began setting up his camera equipment to document these horrors, Sarah moved through the basement, checking on the other captives and whispering words of reassurance. It was during this process that they made a discovery that transformed their understanding of Venier's operation from merely criminal to something approaching the demonic. In what had once been the Opera House's wine cellar, they found a makeshift laboratory where Kellerman had conducted his experiments. Tables lined with glass bottles, syringes, and surgical instruments pointed to medical procedures that went far beyond simple sedation. Detailed notes, written in German but partially translated into English, described experiments in behavioral modification, pain tolerance, and what Kellerman referred to as psychological reconstruction. But the most damning evidence was found in Venier's office, located in what had formerly been the Opera House's box office. Hidden behind a false panel was the ledger Sarah had described, but its contents were far more extensive than she had realized. The ledger contained detailed records of 43 individuals who had been acquired for the Cabinet of Wonders over a period of 8 years. Each entry included the person's real name, their place of origin, the circumstances of their acquisition, and their assigned stage identity. More disturbing still were the notations indicating which captives had died in custody and how those deaths had been concealed. 17 individuals were listed as currently active performers. The remaining 26 were marked as discontinued, a euphemism that Fairchild realized must refer to captives who had died during their imprisonment, or who had been murdered when they became too damaged or ill to perform. But just as Fairchild was photographing the ledger pages by the light of his shaded lantern, a sound from the basement stairs turned his blood cold. Heavy footsteps descending toward them, accompanied by the low murmur of voices. Their trap had been sprung. The sweet, cloying odor Fairchild had noticed earlier suddenly became recognizable. Chloroform. And the concentration in the air was increasing rapidly. Someone had been feeding the chemical into the basement ventilation system, probably for several minutes before they had even stepped foot in the building. Sarah, who had been moving between the cells checking on other captives, suddenly collapsed near the far end of the basement. Fairchild, fighting desperately against the effects of the drug, managed to gather his camera and the most critical ledger pages before his own consciousness began to fade. The last thing he saw before losing consciousness was the imposing figure of Cornelius Venier descending the stairs, a lantern in one hand and a revolver in the other. Behind him came Sheriff Cromwell and Dr. Kellerman, along with 2 men Fairchild didn't recognize. Hired muscle, presumably, brought in to help implement the emergency protocol. As consciousness slipped away, Fairchild understood with perfect, terrible clarity that he and Sarah were about to become the next entries in Venier's ledger of discontinued acquisitions. When Fairchild regained consciousness, he found himself in one of the basement cells, shackled to the wall with the same heavy chains that held the other captives. His camera was gone, along with the ledger pages he had fought to hold on to. Sarah was in the cell beside his, still unconscious from the chloroform. The hours that followed brought a level of terror Fairchild had never imagined possible. Venier, Kellerman, and Cromwell took turns interrogating him, demanding to know who else he had informed about their operation and whether he had managed to get any information to outside authorities. Their methods were brutal and calculated. Kellerman, drawing on his precise knowledge of human anatomy and pain thresholds, inflicted agonies that left no permanent marks, but were excruciating beyond description. Cromwell relied on more traditional techniques. Beatings with leather straps, near drowning in buckets of ice water, and the psychological torture of detailed descriptions of what would happen to Sarah if Fairchild refused to cooperate. But it was Veneer himself who proved to be the most genuinely terrifying interrogator. His approach was coldly intellectual, almost academic in its precision. He seemed authentically curious about Fairchild's motivations, asking thoughtful questions about his background, his family, his ambitions as a journalist. It gradually became clear that Veneer was evaluating whether Fairchild might be converted into another performer for his cabinet of wonders. "You have a certain presence, Thomas," Veneer mused during one of their exchanges. "Intelligent eyes, good bone structure. With the right training and adjustments, you could be quite compelling on stage. I'm thinking perhaps the Scholar of Sorrows, or the Melancholy Gentleman. A former man of letters, driven mad by forbidden knowledge. We could build a very compelling act around that." The casual ease with which Veneer discussed transforming him into a performing commodity was perhaps more terrifying than any physical torture. It revealed the complete and total absence of normal human empathy that had allowed him to operate his enterprise for so many years without ever appearing to feel a moment of remorse. But even as he endured these interrogations, Fairchild was gathering information. The sessions revealed that the operation was far more extensive than he had initially imagined. Veneer maintained contacts in at least 6 states. A network of corrupt officials and compliant medical practitioners who helped identify and acquire suitable candidates for his shows. More disturbing still was the revelation that the Cabinet of Wonders was not Veneer's only enterprise. He also operated what he called private exhibitions, exclusive performances for wealthy clients who paid premium prices for entertainments of a far more intimate and disturbing nature. These private shows frequently involved forced performances of a sexual or violent character. And it was these exhibitions that generated the majority of Veneer's profits. The emergency protocol, triggered by Fairchild's investigation, called not just for the elimination of witnesses, but for the complete dissolution of the Millerville operation. Veneer had already begun arranging to relocate to a facility in Ohio, where a corrupt asylum director had agreed to provide cover for his activities. The plan called for the murder of all current captives, the destruction of all records, and the staged accidental deaths of anyone who might conceivably connect Veneer to what had happened, including not just Fairchild and Sarah, but several townspeople who had asked uncomfortable questions over the years, and even Peter, Kellerman's nervous young assistant, who was considered a liability. But Veneer had made a crucial miscalculation. He had assumed Fairchild was operating alone, driven by nothing more than journalistic curiosity and personal ambition. What he had no way of knowing was that Fairchild had been conducting a quiet, ongoing correspondence with a former colleague at the Philadelphia Inquirer, Margaret Dalton, who had established herself as one of the very few female investigative journalists working in the country. Fairchild had initially been sending Dalton weekly letters as a simple courtesy, keeping her informed about life in a small Pennsylvania town. But as his suspicions about Veneer's operation had deepened, the tone of those letters had changed significantly. In his final letter, sent just 2 days before Sarah's escape, he had explicitly laid out his concerns about the Cabinet of Wonders and had asked Dalton to contact federal authorities if she didn't hear from him within 10 days. That 10-day deadline was rapidly approaching, and Dalton had already begun making inquiries through her contacts at the Treasury Department and the newly formed Bureau of Investigation. What's more, she had taken the precaution of forwarding copies of Fairchild's letters to colleagues at newspapers in Pittsburgh and New York, ensuring the story could not be completely suppressed, even if something happened to both of them. On the morning of October 28, 1891, as Veneer was finalizing his plans to erase all evidence of his operation. A telegram arrived at the Millerville telegraph office that would change everything. Addressed to Sheriff Cromwell, but intended for a very different audience. The telegram was from Margaret Dalton, deliberately worded to appear routine while actually serving as a warning signal to Fairchild. It read, Sheriff Cromwell, conducting research for article on traveling entertainments. Require interview with Thomas Fairchild and Cornelius Veneer, federal authorities interested in regional business practices. Arriving November 1st with documentation team. Please arrange meetings. M. Dalton, Philadelphia Inquirer. The telegraph operator, a gossipy man named Henry Walsh who prided himself on knowing everything happening in town, immediately brought the telegram to Cromwell's attention, but Walsh also mentioned it to several other people during his daily rounds, including the barkeeper at the Millerville Social Club, who passed it along to Veneer that same evening. The realization that federal authorities were taking an interest in his operation sent Veneer spiraling into genuine panic. The emergency protocol, which had been designed to eliminate local threats, was entirely inadequate for dealing with federal investigators and national press attention. Worse still, the telegram's reference to a documentation team strongly implied that Dalton already had evidence of wrongdoing in her possession. If that evidence had been shared with federal authorities, Veneer's network of corrupt local officials would offer him no protection whatsoever. Faced with the unraveling of everything he had built, Veneer made the decision that would ultimately seal his downfall. Rather than attempting to flee or quietly destroy evidence, he chose to accelerate his timeline and implement the most extreme version of his emergency protocol. He would eliminate all the captives immediately, stage a catastrophic fire to destroy the opera house and any remaining evidence, and then disappear with whatever assets he could quickly convert to cash. The plan was desperate and poorly conceived, but in his panic, Veneer couldn't see past it. What he didn't realize was that his frantic, rushed decision-making would give both his captives and the authorities precisely the opening they needed to bring his reign of terror to its end. The night of October 29th, 1891 began with what appeared to be the systematic execution of Vandermeer's emergency protocol. Kellerman had prepared massive doses of morphine and strychnine, intending to poison all 17 captives quickly and relatively quietly. The plan called for their bodies to be doused with kerosene and burned along with the opera house, leaving no physical evidence of their imprisonment. But Peter, Kellerman's nervous young assistant, had finally reached his breaking point. The young man had been gnawed by guilt over his role in the operation for months. The prospect of standing by while 17 people were murdered in cold blood was simply more than his conscience could absorb. Instead of helping Kellerman prepare the poison, Peter made a desperate choice that would ultimately save multiple lives. He slipped away from the opera house and ran to the home of Reverend Samuel Brooks, the pastor of Millerville's Methodist Church, and one of the very few local figures who had never been touched by Veneer's influence or money. Brooks initially dismissed Peter's frantic account as the ravings of a deeply disturbed young man. But the detailed, accurate knowledge Peter possessed about the opera house layout, combined with his precise descriptions of people who had supposedly been dead for years, gradually convinced the Reverend that he was hearing the truth. Working together, Brooks and Peter developed a plan. Brooks would send urgent telegrams to the Pennsylvania State Police and the governor's office, while Peter would return to the opera house and do whatever he could to delay Kellerman's poisoning operation. But their plan faced a critical obstacle: time. Kellerman had already begun administering what he told the captives were routine sedatives, but which were in fact the first stage of a three-part poisoning process carefully designed to produce what would appear to be natural deaths from heart failure. Peter's return to the opera house was a masterpiece of desperate improvisation. He told Kellerman that Cromwell wanted to interrogate the captives one final time before their elimination, buying precious hours while Reverend Brooks's telegrams made their way to the state capitol. Meanwhile, in his basement cell, Fairchild had been quietly working on his own escape plan. The chloroform exposure and the beatings that followed had left him badly weakened, but his mind remained sharp. He had observed that his cell's restraints, while effective, were anchored to a section of the basement wall that had been compromised by years of moisture and structural settling. Using a combination of careful leverage and persistent pressure, he had been gradually working the anchor bolt loose from the crumbling masonry. The process was agonizingly slow and painful, and he had to be meticulous about concealing his efforts during the periodic checks made by his captors. As the night wore on, several developments began to converge in ways that none of the participants had anticipated. Fairchild's anchor bolt finally came free at almost exactly the same moment that Peter was upstairs running his delaying tactics. And just as the first Pennsylvania state police officers were beginning their journey toward Millerville in response to Reverend Brooks's telegrams, Fairchild slipped out of his cell. His escape from the cell was only the beginning of an even more dangerous phase of his ordeal. The basement was still guarded, and he was severely weakened from days of captivity and abuse. But his knowledge of the building's layout, gained during his brief photographic expedition, allowed him to navigate the corridors and begin reaching the other captives. What he found as he started freenary the prisoners was a testament to both the resilience of the human spirit and the devastating consequences of prolonged psychological destruction. Many of the captives were so heavily drugged or so deeply broken that they couldn't understand what was happening around them. Others, particularly those who had been imprisoned for years, were too frightened to move, convinced that any attempt at escape would only bring worse punishment down on them. Sarah, despite everything she had endured, proved invaluable in those desperate moments. Her earlier escape had given her credibility with the group, and her intimate knowledge of each captive's individual fears and personal history allowed her to communicate effectively even with those who were barely conscious. Their liberation efforts were further complicated by the physical condition of many of the captives. Yon was so severely weakened by malnutrition that he could barely stand. Catherine Ali had developed a serious respiratory condition that made any physical exertion extremely difficult. Several others were dealing with injuries and medical conditions that Kellerman had deliberately left untreated as part of his control strategy. As they worked to free as many people as possible, Fairchild and Sarah could hear growing commotion on the floors above them. Raised voices, heavy footsteps, the sound of furniture being moved, suggesting that Veneer and his associates were pushing forward with some part of their emergency protocol. The situation reached its crisis point when Kellerman, growing suspicious of Peter's persistent delays, decided to personally check on the captives. His discovery of Fairchild's empty cell and the ongoing liberation effort triggered an immediate alarm that brought Veneer and Cromwell rushing down to the basement. What followed was a chaotic, desperate confrontation in the narrow basement corridors, with 17 weakened captives caught in the crossfire between their liberators and their captors. Veneer was armed with a revolver and backed by Cromwell and several hired men. On paper, a commanding advantage, But in his rage and desperation, Vanier made a critical tactical error. Instead of focusing on systematically recapturing the escaping prisoners, he became fixated on Fairchild personally, treating the journalist's defiance as a personal insult that demanded immediate punishment. That fixation gave Sarah and several of the more mobile captives the opening they needed to reach the basement stairs and begin making their way to the upper floors of the building. Their escape was aided by Peter, who had positioned himself at the top of the stairs and was able to call out warnings about the movements of Vanier's men on the main floor. The confrontation reached its climax when Cromwell, in pursuit of Sarah and two other escapees, came face to face with an entirely unexpected obstacle. Reverend Brooks, accompanied by 3 Pennsylvania state police officers. The Reverend's arrival at the Opera House wasn't part of any planned rescue operation. He had grown concerned about Peter's safety and had decided to personally verify that help was truly on its way. The state officers were an advance team who had reached Millerville faster than anyone had expected, thanks to a fortuitous rail connection. The sight of legitimate law enforcement standing in his opera house sent Cromwell into a panic. His first instinct was to assert his authority as the local sheriff, but the state officers had already been briefed about the suspected corruption of local officials. In the confusion that followed, captives streaming up from the basement, state officers trying to sort out who was who, Vanier made his final desperate move. Rather than surrender or attempt to flee, he retreated to his office with Kellerman and barricaded himself inside. Their plan was to destroy all remaining documentary evidence of their operation and then fight their way out of the building. What they failed to realize was that Fairchild had already photographed the most damning pages of the ledger during his earlier infiltration, and that copies of those photographs were hidden in a location known only to him and Sarah. The standoff in Vanier's office lasted nearly 3 hours. During that time, additional state police officers arrived, along with a representative from the Pennsylvania Attorney General's office, who had been alerted through Margaret Dalton's federal contacts. Outside the barricaded door, a remarkable scene was unfolding. 17 human beings who had been officially declared dead were being documented, photographed, and interviewed by authorities. Many were in such poor physical condition that they required immediate medical attention, but all of them were alive, and most retained enough clarity of mind to provide testimony about what had been done to them. The breakthrough in the standoff came from a wholly unexpected source. Jon Brenner, the gentle giant whose mind had been so thoroughly damaged by years of captivity, suddenly experienced a moment of startling clarity when he caught sight of Kellerman through the office window. The rage that erupted from this normally passive man was extraordinary in its intensity. Using the enormous physical strength that had made him famous on stage, Jon began systematically tearing apart the barricade Vanier and Kellerman had constructed. The heavy furniture that would have stopped any ordinary man was no obstacle for someone of Jon's size and determination. Within minutes, he had created an opening wide enough for the state police officers to push through. Kellerman's capture was accomplished without any violence. The false doctor had collapsed into a state of total nervous exhaustion and offered no resistance at all. Vanier proved more resilient. When officers entered his office, they found him calmly feeding documents into a small fire he had built in a metal waste basket. "Gentlemen," he said, without looking up from the flames, "I'm afraid you're too late. Whatever crimes you believe you can prove against me died with these papers." But Vanier's confidence was profoundly misplaced. Even as he fed his records to the fire, Thomas Fairchild was working with investigators to reconstruct the full operation from his photographs and the testimony of the survivors. More critically, Peter's detailed first-hand knowledge of the day-to-day workings of the enterprise gave investigators information that no written record could have captured. The arrest of Sheriff Josiah Cromwell proved almost anticlimactic. Faced with overwhelming evidence of his corruption and the testimony of multiple independent witnesses, he moved immediately to negotiate a plea arrangement in exchange for information about Vanier's broader network of accomplices. But perhaps the most significant moment of that terrible night came when Catherine Ali, her voice still damaged, but her spirit entirely unbroken, began to sing. It was a hymn her mother had taught her as a little girl. And one by one, the other survivors joined in. Their voices, weak and scarred but undeniably human, filled the opera house with a sound that was simultaneously heartbreaking and triumphant. As dawn broke over Millerville on October 30th, 1891, the full scope of Vanier's operation was beginning to come into focus. The 17 survivors represented only a fraction of the total number of victims who had passed through his operation over the years. The other 26 individuals, listed in his ledger as discontinued, would never have the chance to see justice served. The trials that followed became a sensation throughout Pennsylvania and across the broader United States. The case represented one of the earliest major prosecutions of organized human trafficking in American legal history, and the proceedings were covered extensively by newspapers from coast to coast. Cornelius Vanier was ultimately convicted on 43 counts of kidnapping, 17 counts of unlawful imprisonment, and 26 counts of murder. The evidence against him was overwhelming. A combination of physical proof, documentary evidence, and the courage of survivors willing to speak publicly about everything that had been done to them. His execution, carried out on March 15, 1893, drew protesters on both sides of the capital punishment debate. But there was precious little public sympathy for a man who had so methodically destroyed so many lives purely for profit. Dr. Heinrich Kellerman received a sentence of life imprisonment after cooperating extensively with investigators. His detailed confessions provided authorities with information that led to arrests in 6 states and the exposure of a network of corruption that extended far beyond Millerville. Perhaps most importantly, Kellerman's meticulous medical records allowed investigators to fully understand the scope of the psychological and physical damage inflicted on the victims, making it possible to provide meaningful treatment and support. Sheriff Josiah Cromwell's cooperation with prosecutors earned him a reduced sentence of 20 years in prison. He served only 7 before dying of a heart attack in 1899. His detailed testimony about the corruption of local officials led to the removal of 3 judges, 2 county commissioners, and dozens of minor officials throughout western Pennsylvania. The fates of the 17 survivors varied dramatically. Some, like Sarah Henley, were able to rebuild their lives with the support of their families and communities. Sarah herself became an advocate for victims of human trafficking, working alongside law enforcement to identify and prosecute similar operations. Jon Brenner's recovery was more limited. The years of psychological abuse had left him with permanent cognitive damage, but he was able to live independently with the support of his church community in Philadelphia. He never fully regained the ability to speak coherently about his experiences, but he found peace working as a handyman and gardener until his death in 1923. Catherine Ali's voice never fully healed from the damage inflicted during her captivity, but she was able to return to her family in Scranton and eventually married a local merchant who had waited for her despite believing her to be dead. She lived quietly until 1934, rarely speaking about what she had endured, but maintaining correspondence with other survivors until the very end of her life. Thomas Fairchild's coverage of the Veneer case cemented his reputation as one of America's leading investigative journalists. He eventually moved to New York and worked for several major newspapers. But he never forgot the lesson Millerville had taught him about the importance of those giving voice to those who cannot speak for themselves. Margaret Dalton's pivotal role in exposing the operation led to her being hired by the Philadelphia Inquirer as their first female investigative correspondent. She continued working closely with Fairchild on cases involving corruption and human trafficking, and their partnership resulted in the exposure of several other criminal operations throughout the 1890s. The Millerville Opera House was demolished in 1892, and the site remained vacant for decades. In 1934, the city erected a small memorial garden on the location, with a plaque commemorating the 17 survivors and the 26 victims who did not live to see justice served. But perhaps the most enduring impact of the Veneer case was its effect on American law enforcement and legal procedure. The case demonstrated the urgent need for better coordination between local, state, and federal authorities when investigating crimes that crossed jurisdictional lines. More importantly, it cast a harsh light on the vulnerability of marginalized populations, immigrants, orphans, and people with disabilities, to organized exploitation and abuse. The public attention surrounding the case led to the establishment of several advocacy organizations and contributed directly to reforms in how missing persons cases were investigated and documented. The case also had a profound effect on the regulation of traveling entertainments and circuses. New laws required performers to carry documentation proving their voluntary participation, and regular inspections were introduced to ensure that traveling shows were not being used as cover for criminal operations. Yet even as justice was finally served and reforms were put in place, deeply troubling questions remained. Cromwell's testimony revealed that Veneer's operation was part of a far larger network of human trafficking that stretched throughout the eastern United States. While many of his accomplices were eventually arrested, others simply vanished, presumably continuing their activities in new locations under new identities. The investigation also uncovered the disturbing fact that several of the individuals listed as discontinued in Veneer's ledger had actually been sold to other operators, rather than killed. Despite extensive efforts by law enforcement, the vast majority of these people were never found, and their ultimate fate remains unknown. Perhaps most troubling of all was the realization that Veneer's operation had been able to function for so long precisely because it exploited the deepest prejudices and most comfortable indifferences of the society around it. The ease with which death certificates could be falsified for people with disabilities, the willingness of officials to accept bribes and look the other way, the public's appetite for entertainments that reduced their performers to spectacles rather than human beings. All of these things had combined to create an environment in which such horrors could not only exist but flourish. In the end, the Millerville case stands as both a testament to human resilience and a warning about the capacity for evil that emerges when greed, prejudice, and power intersect in the absence of accountability and justice. The 17 people who survived Veneer's Cabinet of Wonders had their names officially restored to the living, their fraudulent death certificates voided, and their stories preserved for history. But somewhere in the shadows of America's past, how many other voices remain silenced? How many other victims of operations like this one never found their way to freedom? This mystery reminds us that the most horrifying monsters in history have always been entirely human, driven by greed, and made possible by corruption and indifference. What do you think of this story? Do you believe the full truth was ever revealed? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this and want more stories like it, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share it with someone who loves a dark mystery. I'll see you in the next one.